I've recently been playing Ghost Song, which is a game that has excellent art, and has really nailed that immersive atmosphere. So I want us to go over some things that this game does well, and then take the scene I made in my previous video on Procreate and recreate it in a style a bit closer to Ghost Song. This video will be a bit longer, so I'll break it into chapters so that you can jump around. I'll start by giving a quick review and if I recommend the game. I do. But I also want to discuss some things that I think sticks out with this game, and that is the idea of a boring challenge. We'll finish off with discussing the excellent art and atmosphere, and recreate some aspects of it. Ghost Song is a pretty standard Metroidvania when it comes down to it. The attack patterns are somewhat generic, the abilities are the standard double jump, wall jump, and dash. Most of the combat is using a gun, and the weapons are not too original, but still interesting to play around with. It has a charm system that is extremely similar to the one used in Hollow Knight, so if you're familiar with it, you'll feel right at home. I would barely call it a platformer personally. It has very little platforming, and the few challenges that exist are more in the annoying category. So if you're more of an Ori or Celeste type of person, this game might not be for you. The structure of the game is sort of like a long drawn out fetch mission. You go and collect some things. But I personally think it works really well within the Metroidvania format. It really gives you the option to explore freely, but you still kind of always know where to go and what to do. Overall, I think it's a fun game. It has excellent art. It is definitely challenging. I enjoyed it, and I think it would be worth giving it a try. With that said, let's discuss some game design aspects of Ghost Song. This will honestly mainly be a discussion on boring challenges, which might make you think that I hate the game. I don't, but it is in my opinion a consistent issue and something I would want to avoid with my own game, and hopefully make you avoid with yours too. When you die, you drop your corpse and need to fetch it to get the money you were carrying, and if you die twice in a row, you lose your money. I'm not a big fan of this system. I think there are some benefits in that it forces you to challenge yourself or take a hit to your bank account. But there's always a risk that you build up this sunken cost fallacy and just stay at a place that is way too difficult for you to complete. I think that Ghost Song compounds this in that it makes it extremely difficult or sometimes literally impossible to fetch your corpse if you die to a boss fight. So you can't regret taking a boss fight without losing your money. On top of this game has a kind of strange system with repairs. If you die, you take a hit to your health, and unless you go and repair that damage, you won't get that health back. So we have a system where you go to a boss and practice fighting it. You die lots of times, and you can never repair your damage because you can't fetch your corpse without fighting the boss. So you won't have the money to repair it, which means that the boss technically becomes progressively harder the better you get at fighting it. This to me is a really strange system, even though it is a conceptually interesting mechanic. I feel that you really need to be aware with the difference between a fun challenge and a boring one. Being punished as a player rarely feels fun and exciting, even though it is a challenge. If a player ever gives up on a boss because they stumbled upon it too early in the game, losing that money they could have otherwise spent on upgrades will just leave them with a bad taste in their mouth. To build on to this idea of a boring challenge, this game always has at least 2 rooms separating your spawn point from the boss, which means that every time you lose to the boss, you have to run through some small annoying enemies, and the quicker you want to get to the boss, the more careless you'll be and the more damage you'll take. It's never fun to take this type of damage. It's something you know that you can kill easily if you just slow down, but it's not fun to slow down and kill an enemy that you've already killed 50 times before. I really think that the concept laid out so perfectly in Celeste should be kept to. If you have a challenge, make the spawn point immediate, and the challenge right there. It keeps up the excitement for the challenge, that one more attempt. Whereas this one is more likely to make you suicide to the boss just so you can start with more HP. There's a similar issue with platforming. When we create a platforming challenge, I really think we should conceive of it similar to how a boss functions. You have a specific set of moves that you need to time and execute. The moves are difficult to manage, but still interesting. And if you fail, you blame yourself and not the game. But if we look at the platforming in this game, it often comes in this style, where you have a room, you need to jump across these spiked things. So you first shoot them, then stand on them, then shoot the next, and then jump. And then you need to time it before they respawn. Then you have these flying units that will hit you if you miss your timing. This is actually quite a tricky thing to do, and could be an interesting challenge, except you can kill all these flying units. And if you do, shooting these platforms become a trivial task. Should you do this difficult, interesting challenge, and if you die, you spawn back here? Or should you kill every single unit so that you can pass this room? This is the game giving you the option of having a fun challenge or a long boring task, and then telling you to do the long boring task. This is in part why I really think the fetch your corpse mechanic is so tricky to implement well. Ideally, there shouldn't be a boring way to complete that challenge. These units shouldn't be killable. They should be spinning discs or something, so that you feel a sense of accomplishment once you manage it. But it's very possible that these units were changed to be killable simply because the challenge wouldn't be fun if you on top of it have to fetch your corpse. Having too few save points and teleports is a common complaint for any game that implements them. Even Hollow Knight gets his fair share of criticism on this point. I personally think it's a tricky balance to get right. If the player can jump all over the map in an instant, they will, and they'll miss out on the cool exploration. But once you have played the game for 8 hours and traversed the entire map 3 times, doing it the 4th time suddenly isn't as enticing. I don't know exactly how to solve this well. Maybe gatekeeping some of the teleports until late game would be one way to do it. It's definitely one of those things that can extend the length of your game artificially, and that is my biggest takeaway from myself. Don't pad the runtime. This game seemed to have widely different playtimes, but a big part of that playtime is walking, taking hits from annoying enemies, and going back to one of the 5 vendors in the game to repair your armor before you spend your money before the next boss fight. I think it's an easy way to extend the length of your game, and some players might not feel that a $20 game is worth it unless they spend 10 hours playing it. But at least for me, from now on, I'll always try and ask myself, is this a boring challenge? And then think of a way to make the challenge itself more exciting. With that out of the way, I just want to mention 2 things. Always make your game controller remappable, and always try and allow for both a keyboard and a controller. I'm a keyboard player, but I had to get a controller for this game. I think that there's always a risk of alienating some part of your audience if you don't allow their desired input method in preference of your own. And lastly, if you implement a charm system, like in Hollow Knight, I don't think you should add charms that are absolutely necessary for gameplay. The compass charm and the geo-collecting charm was a bad choice then, and is a bad choice now. There are some quality of life features that players want in order for the game to feel good, so having to choose between quality of life or nice gameplay is really a shitty experience in my opinion. I'll also add here that it's always good to over-signal. There are multiple normal fights in this game that look like boss fights, because they lock you in, but then there are also boss fights that don't feel like boss fights. Adding a sense of gravitas to the boss fight can be really important to better sell the idea that the player accomplished something difficult. I actually got stuck on this fight because I thought that it was a really difficult boss. Turns out it's a normal fight that locks you in, together with an optional boss fight. It honestly feels like it's willingly trying to confuse you at that point. If you disagree or have a different view or approach to the idea of a boring challenge, please comment down below. Okay, let's move on to the art and discuss the atmosphere in this game. Having a game with really good atmosphere is really about managing to sell an idea, a singular coherent mood, theme, or environment. In order to implement this, you really need to know what that feeling or environment is, and how you can communicate that feeling. So let's start from this mood or theme, and then go step by step through all the choices you need to make to service that theme. It's a game set on a desolate planet with alien life forms. It's inhospitable and kind of mysterious. As a player, you don't know anything about where you are or where you're going. Everything around you is sort of unfamiliar and creepy. In order to sell this well, it's not only about what you draw and add to your scene. Even the art style needs to be adapted to sell this idea. If you look at any of the art that I tend to make, it's very clean, thick lines, very little texture. You read the scene once and it makes sense. There's nothing wrong with the style, but it isn't going to sell a desolate, creepy mood. It's too clean. If we look at the scene like this, the first thing that sticks out is the amount of tiny details. We're overloading the user with information, almost trying to create a sense of trypophobia in the player. So on top of making small details, we also want these details to not make complete sense or to fit your expectation. You don't just add clean rocks, you add small strands sticking out from those rocks. And it's not going to be some nice smooth grass, but individual strands, like you're looking at someone's hairy armpit. When you add spikes, they aren't nice clean triangles, but sort of organic bony material, almost reminding you of an insect leg. You can still add nice pretty art, but sometimes the idea of creating something ugly or unsettling can really make the player feel that unsettling feeling. They are feeling the mood you want to create, and in order to achieve that, you sometimes need to lean into the ugly. On top of this, we really want to constrict the player. Claustrophobia is your friend. We can see Hollow Knight employ this in Deep Nest. Most of Hollow Knight is open environments, but in Deep Nest it all feels very dark and constricted. In part, this will affect level design, but sometimes you can take an otherwise open area and just add a ceiling to better sell the idea of confinement. Further than that, we can really push it so that the foreground is limited and goes dark quite quickly. There aren't many foregrounds in this game that feel open and calming. It's often quite cramped and narrow. At the same time, as we mentioned earlier, the background is often full of details, and when we are above ground, there are an immense amount of background layers, making you feel like there's a rich and complex world beyond where you're walking. There's an element of creating a world that is really about adding details and intricacies to make that world real and lived in. A small sign, a corpse, dirt, grass sticking out from weird places. A lot of what makes something feel real is that when we walk around in our everyday life, we see cracks, stains, stickers. But it's easy to create art that is just too perfect, too artificial. And as an artist, we kind of have to go back and dirty up our place, add stuff to it. But this can easily come with a cost that I've talked about multiple times on this channel before: clutter. and clutter will affect readability. But as long as we reduce the contrast of the background and make the platforms and enemies stand out, we can still ensure that this doesn't cause too much of a problem. We can also blur the background just a bit to ensure that the foreground and platforming area is the parts that we can read most clearly. This is really where we can make use of particle effects as well. One of the biggest aspects of making a world come to life is really about adding particle effects. They add movement to your scene, which removes that static artificial aspect that drawn assets will naturally have. The added benefit is that particle effects can also be used to reduce contrast while also adding life. So we have a lot of floating clouds of different colors that gives the area a sense of space. An interesting choice here is that there's generally not much movement in the particle effects. Instead, they're placed on different parallax layers, meaning that when you move, you can see where each cloud or particle is. But when you stand still, the particle is almost stationary as well. This is something that also helps sell the idea of the environment you're in. That lack of movement gives the area a lack of gravity, of empty stale air. Every choice will have an effect, and you will need to think about it and evaluate it for each area. In this safe area, we have quite a bit of movement. Up above ground it's raining, but down below, it's stale with particles floating almost still. To further sell the idea of the area having a life of its own, it can always be good to add more movement, either by animating some assets, like branches or bushes moving, or adding literal critters that don't do anything more than add movement to the environment. As a last point, bloom filters also really help sell this idea. I've gone over this effect in my Eterna Noctis video, but basically this makes any area of brightness be slightly diffused and shine. So with bloom on, we get this, and with bloom off, it looks like this. It makes a huge difference. Overall, the color choices also matter here. If you want to sell an alien world, go for colors that don't appear in the natural world. So we see a lot of neon colors, a lot of colder colors, which also helps sell the idea that we are on a desolate planet. Make the colors feel unfamiliar, and you will impart that unfamiliar feeling on the player. So let's take from these things that we have mentioned, and see if we can also achieve a sense of atmosphere. We have small organic lines, overly detailed assets, immense amount of layers and background detail, narrow paths, particle effects, and the particles don't move much, but are on different layers. We want it to be kinda dark and gloomy, and not much foreground. And then we add some small critters. We'll take this scene from my last video on Procreate. This scene is extremely clean, sort of cute and simple, so it'll be easier to compare the two afterwards. We can start step by step. We'll start by making very thin line art with lots of details. I think a key thing, if you really want to sell that unsettling feeling, is to accept all mistakes and imperfect lines. We really don't want our art to be clean, because if it's clean, then the scene will feel clean. So leaning into the ugly bad line art. For these bushes, this is really more about making small circles to really give you a sense of trypophobia. But for rocks, we almost want to intentionally make the line wave a bit. And when we make a tree, we want to get the extreme end of this. So we can take our flat and straight tree, and just make everything curve and wave. Since we're mainly redrawing the assets from the Procreate scene, there isn't much work required to get a first draft. As we can see, at the moment the scene mostly looks like we're making an artistic choice to be sort of loose and not coloring within the lines. But the scene also feels more rich. So I personally think we're on the right track. Now we have to add texturing and shadows. So we'll go back over each asset. Even at this stage, we add details and richness to our texturing. We build out the form that our line art created, adding shadows at appropriate places. So we are really just shadowing on the outside of each bush. And then I've intentionally bunched up and left spaces in the line art, so I kinda have something to follow. When I go over the rocks, I initially do a pass of dark on the bottom and light on the top. And then I use the smudge tool to create a gradient. On top of this, wherever my line art creates a dent, I just shade that part of the asset. It's a really easy way to create some texture to your rock without having to think too much. I didn't intend to create this shape, it just happened because my line art wasn't perfect. For the tree we have to do a lot of passes. Trees always take a long time, but I generally think it's worthwhile to give them some attention. In general, when I do my texturing on trees, I just follow the shape of the asset. When we update all the assets in our scene, it still looks kind of flat. We can quickly start adding some particle effects to see if we can improve the mysteriousness of our scene a bit. We can see in Ghost Song that they highlighted each background layer with a shine. So we'll do that and add a particle effect to separate each layer with a fancy purple color. This really helps add both depth while also giving the scene a mood. You can implement this with a single gradient sprite, but in this case I've used some particle effects to get added movement and some color shift. Back in our drawing program we add more textures and contrast. At this point I also think it makes sense to shift some of the colors, especially if we want to unsettle the player. This yellow color isn't cutting it. Shifting this color to a more orange-red type is better at conveying a sickly disease feel. The flatness of this scene is really about the contrast being too low. We can quickly go into adjustments and shift each layer to make it stand out more. Then we plug everything back into our scene, and now I think we're really getting somewhere. The colors are relatively coherent, there's quite a decent contrast in the foreground. there's good separation between the platforms and the background, and even the background layers have good separation in between them. However, I still think the assets are relatively clean, so I think we should go back and try and dirty the scene a bit more. So we'll go over each asset and add specs to them, making them look more gritty. The only purpose of this is to make it look as if there's more information there. We don't have to care too much about each individual line. In this case, we could use a brush, but I had trouble finding one that would fit, so I slowly dotted the entire asset. We can see here, if we compare before and after, that there's a significant difference. It's overall not an immense effect in the scene itself, and in this case it definitely took some time. Whether dirtying each asset is worth it, I don't know, but I kind of like it. As I mentioned earlier, a big part of making the scene look more serene is to add bloom. You kind of have to play around with the strength and intensity of it, but once you have it, it can really help make the scene glow. We added specks and bloom, and now our scene is starting to look less perfect and more natural. But if you really want to remove the feeling of an artificial scene, we should add some animations or critters, some more movement to the scene. So let's draw some insects. And here I really want to point out why making something imperfect can really give the player a sense of uneasiness. Let's animate an insect to walk in this type of random pattern. We'll just redraw the insect each time. Some frames will be bigger, some frames will be smaller. Then as a point of comparison, let's animate it by only changing the legs, but having the body stay consistent across its movement. We can see that this top one that we did freehand is significantly more shiny and gross looking. Now this is obviously not an efficient or optimized way of creating or running an animation. It is 80 frames, but even if you were to just make a few frames and then move it, it doesn't hurt to add some imperfections to it. While I'm at it, I'll make 2 more, a slimy worm and then something like a spider. I'll add them at various places in my scene, and I'll flip them around so I can reuse them without it being too obvious. And there we have a bit more life in the scene. I'll also make and add a few more assets to the scene, so I'll make a few more rocks for instance. And if we walk to the side we can see some rocks and a cliff here, and here we're really pushing the path to be significantly more narrow. And with some added insects, here we can hopefully get the player some of that uneasy feeling. Sometimes in cases like this, it could be worthwhile to add a grain shader. I can show you roughly how it would look if you push it, but obviously if you were to use it, you would tone it down significantly. But that would be tricky to show here with compression on the video. With that said, I think a big portion of what makes this specific atmosphere work is the use of small creepy details. But this really puts a significantly higher workload on you as an artist. This new scene took me 15 to 20 hours to make, whereas the Procreate scene in my previous video only took me around 5 hours. So if you want to employ this method as a solo developer, you might have to reuse assets more often, which is something that I think Ghost Song has done to a significant degree. But this is really only if you want to create this type of atmosphere. But you have other games like Hollow Knight or Ori that also accomplishes this quite well. Atmosphere is really about understanding what it is the player should feel and making them feel that with your art. One consistent thing for all of this will be to add strange details and working with colors and particle effects. It can really help sell the environment quite quickly, even if you have a simple and clean art style. This isn't particular to any art style. It's just about removing the feeling of something constructed, which can easily pull the player away from that immersion. This video was a bit all over the place in terms of content. Please share your thoughts if you think it was interesting to hear a discussion on game design and mechanics, or if I should just stick to discussing art. Thanks for watching. Bye.